Simply solve those things together, and you get $4,120 for the efficiency of labor in Botswana today. That's a long problem. That's a hard problem. That's a problem that requires that you people say, wait a minute, I don't have quite enough information here. I need to make an assumption about the pieces of information I don't have. What assumption makes sense in the context of this model? I expected only about half of you to get it, but it looks like, as best as I can tell, only about a quarter of you got it. So think about this some more. Because the ability to do problems like this in the future would be actually a nice thing to have if you're ever trying to make sense of why some parts of the world are very prosperous and others are not. The ability to parcel out differences, either over time or across countries, between differences in the demographic burdens, in savings investment, and the efficiency of labor is something we have to teach. It's something you should learn. The other problem that I thought was going to be hard, and that did indeed turn out to be hard, is the France problem, right? Problem 10. That in France, population growth has been constant at 1% per year, and France has a savings share of 25% per year, et cetera, et cetera. And France right now has a GDP per capita level of $35,000 per year. Assuming it's on and stays on its steady state balanced growth path, and assuming that the efficiency of labor is growing at 2% per year, how rich is France going to be in 2050 and 2100? And how rich should France have been back at the end of World War II, back in 1946? Here, this just wants you to calculate compound growth. There's very little else to do for this problem. That is, French GDP per capita is growing at 2% per year. Today's level is 35,000 per year. Today's annual level of GDP is 35,000. Growth at 2% per year for 39 more years. Well, if we're accountants, we say 35,000 times 1.02 to the 39th as our growth factor gives us $76,000 a year as the average level of GDP per capita in France come 2050 if nothing goes wrong. Yeah?
Why is it 1.2?
Because it's growing at 2% per year. And in order to calculate compound growth, you take 1, you add to it the growth rate, which is 2% per year, 0.02, and then you raise that to the power of the number of years. That's what compound growth is. And the fact that it gets very large very quickly is an extraordinarily striking thing about it, and a reason that in general, when things are going right, we like compound growth processes, because they make things go righter. When things are going wrong, we don't like compound growth processes at all. So that's part A. On part B, same thing for 2100. Right? It's not 39 years away, it's 89 years away. 35,000 for the level of prosperity today, growing at 2% per year. That gives us 1.02 for 89 years, raised to the 89th power. Will give us $204,000 per year of income for the average man, woman, and child in France come 2100, if nothing goes wrong with the pace of modern economic growth, of capital accumulation, of invention, of innovation, and so on and so forth. So that provided that our people in Silicon Valley do their jobs, and provided the people in the class before us learning about immunology do their jobs and figure out wonderful biotechnology, and provided the people at Haas figure out productive business organizations to make applying all of this technology possible. Right? France is going to be really rich in come 2100 unless we manage to nuke ourselves. Yeah? Yeah. Well, that's how it's going to work. Right? That's one of the interesting things about the solo growth model. One striking thing about it, which is that once your economy's gotten to its balanced growth path, its capital intensity is constant. So that means this term stays the same, and this term's always the same, which means that if output per worker is going to change once you're on your balanced growth path, it's going to change only because the efficiency of labor changes. So that the growth rate of output per worker is the same as the growth rate of the efficiency of labor. At a deep level, this is true because if it weren't true, we'd have picked some other variable to call the efficiency of labor. Right? That it's nice to say that if an economy's growth is balanced, then productivity is growing as fast as the efficiency of labor is growing. But in this model, that's the conclusion that comes out of this model. And it's something that focusing on this equation allows you to assume and allows you to use. Right? So, yeah. Well, that would be total GDP, right? That GDP per capita or per worker is growing as fast as the efficiency of labor is growing. But in total GDP, you don't just have more production per worker or per person, you have more people or workers as well. So the growth rate of total GDP is going to be equal to the growth rate of GDP per capita plus the growth rate of population of the labor force. Here we're asking about GDP per capita in this particular problem. So that's what we're focusing on. And the growth rate of GDP per capita, is indeed going to be the 2% per year. That's the growth rate of the efficiency of labor. Okay. Now we turn this around and we go back in time. We'd say, what would France's level of GDP per capita in 1946 be if it had then been on today's steady state balanced growth path? Well, today's level is $35,000 per year. 1946 is minus 65 years from now. So, and you can use the same equation used for growth in the future to project back into the past, only instead of going 89 or 39 years in the future, instead of having a plus 89 or plus 39 over here, you can put a minus 65 up here, and it works just as perfectly well. And you get $9,855 or today's dollars as what the level of prosperity in France would have been back in 1946, back at the end of World War II, if France was then on its balanced growth path, with the efficiency of labor growing at 2% per year. And now we get part 10D. In fact, in 1946, just after World War II, France was only about 30% as prosperous. We were sending them all kinds of emergency food and other aid in the immediate aftermath of World War II. And so the question is, why was France's level of GDP per capita back in 1946 so very low? Was it because the efficiency of labor in France in 1946 was really, really low, was much lower than our projection? Perhaps a little bit, but France has always been a relatively rich and relatively industrialized country for centuries. It's a standard North Atlantic economy that's been at the leading edge of global prosperity for the past 5 centuries. To say that France had an extraordinary burst of adoption of new technologies in the past half century just won't cut it. And then what's the other possible answer? Was it that France's capital output ratio was low in 1946? Probably. That's the answer I'm looking for, right? Saying that only 2 things could have made France poorer. The first is if the efficiency of labor was much less than this projection projects. The second, if the capital intensity of the economy was wrong. If the capital output ratio was much lower in 1946 because something had gone wrong in France's process of investment before then. What would that something be? Well, once again, here's the answer. So what went wrong with investment in France in the years before 1946? It's called Adolf Hitler. Right? Hitler invades and conquers France along with Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, Denmark, and Norway in 1940. occupies France for 4.5 years. In the meantime, of those 4.5 years, the U.S. Army Air Force bombs the hell out of France, destroying every single railroad bridge we can find, along with other things, in preparation for our invasion in Normandy in 1944. We then fight over France for about 6 months before the U.S. and British and the revived Free French Army disappear off the map into Germany. And so when 1946 comes along, France has been the battleground of World War II for a whole large chunk of the previous 5 years, either on land or during those years when the Nazis are occupying France from the air. That had an extraordinary, although temporary, impact on France's economic prosperity, to have been a battlefield. Okay, so that's the things that I want you to know from problem set 2 that you weren't getting. And to the extent that I don't get far enough to have a full problem set for problem set 3, I'm going to use problem set 3 to try to hammer these back into your heads once again. Other recapitulations. I don't have to teach you anymore how much bigger is total world GDP now than it was 10,000 years ago. You got this. It's 17,000, about 1,200 times bigger because of population, about 14 times bigger because of richer. Multiply those things together, you get 17,000. You know what the unemployment rate is right now. It's 9.4%, although tomorrow morning at 5:30 a.m. Pacific time, the Bureau of Labor Statistics will release its numbers as to what the unemployment rate was during the January survey, which took place in the second week of January. You got Say's law, that the reason that right now our unemployment rate is 9.4% rather than its normal 5% is because people spend their incomes not just on currently produced goods and services, but on financial assets. And right now, a huge number of people in our economy want to have more safe financial assets in their portfolios than they do, and so they've all cut back on spending because they think if we don't spend as much, we'll be able to take our extra savings and put them in financial assets. The problem is they don't recognize that if they don't spend as much, other people don't have as much income. And so other people are going to be unwilling to let go of their financial assets because their incomes have fallen. You got that nailed. What I want to see if you do have nailed is, once again, which is the growth equation that you all should have been using for problem 8 and for the other problems. If we hand you an economic growth problem, it's either going to ask you to do compound growth of one form or another, or odds are you're going to want to start from one particular equation, and you've got it nailed as well. So it should have found problem 8 easier then, to the extent you've gotten that much nailed. So let's see if you can actually do it on the fly again. And as I say, this is very hard. Right? I practiced giving myself 30 seconds and numbers that I haven't known beforehand, to try to actually calculate it by hand without resorting to the pre-automated spreadsheets. And my median time to a correct answer is 45 seconds. That I can get an answer in 25 seconds, but the odds are less than 50-50 it'll be right. Here you beat me. You got 52% have the right answer, which is quite good. And last, the other type of growth question that I want you to be able to handle is really going to be a compound growth question. Right? What's the growth rate of GDP per capita in Zambia over the years since 1960? Okay. All right. And there we have a plurality for the right answer. Now, E can't be right because Zambia is poorer today than it was in 1960. And a positive growth rate would mean it was richer today than it was in 1960. So E can't be right. D can't be right because if something's shrinking at 6% per year, then the rule of 72 tells you that since 72 divided by 6 is 12, then it halves in size every 12 years. So if Zambian GDP were falling at 6% per year, and if it were $1,800 in 1960, well, it would have been $900 in 1972, it would have been $450 in 1984, it would have been $225 in 1996, it would be now $125 today. And since the World Bank's definition of absolute, desperate, total, complete, utter, on the edge of starvation poverty is living on $1 per person per day, that's $365 per capita per year. Pretty much everyone in Zambia would now be dead of starvation, if nothing else. B, again, B, if something's growing at 15.7% per year, by the rule of 72, it's doubling in size every 5 years. And if you start from 1,800, if you double every 5 years, there's no way you're going to be down at 1,300 after 50 years. That, 50 years is 10 times 5, so you'd have had 10 doublings. If something doubles 10 times, it grows to be 1,000 times as big as it used to be. So that would be GDP per capita of 18 million per person in Zambia today, which is definitely not what we see. And 2.8% is, once again, we know it's shrinking, not growing, and a positive growth rate means it's getting bigger, and it isn't. So simply the plus minus should have narrowed you down to between C and D, and then thoughts about the magnitudes, about how quickly something shrinking at 6% per year vanishes, should have led you to hone in on C. I'm sure you'll do better next time. All right, now let me try to quickly finish up with the economic growth unit. It's pretty clear I'm not going to get into the depression economics unit, which means problem set 3 is going to be half of a half problem set, a 5-problem problem set, and then the rest of problem set 3 is going to go into problem set 4. As I said, we knew that modern economic growth started no earlier than 1800. How do we know? Because if it had started earlier, the world before 1800 would have been much poorer than the world in 1800, and it could not have been. But after all, you're spending 70% of your income on food and only getting 2,300 calories a day, and yet engaging in pretty much in hard agricultural labor. You can't be much poorer and still survive. And the world back in 1800 was pretty equal. And the world today is not anything like equal across countries. We have extraordinary divergence over the past 2 centuries, even though as consolation we have some significant convergence since 1980 or so, some significant catch-up. And why did things get worse? Well, the big reason that things got worse during the middle parts of the century was the fact that communism ruled 2/3 of East Asia. And it's truly a theological point, that Lenin, Stalin, Mao, Castro, Kim Il-sung, Pol Pot, Ho Chi Minh, all of them really believed Marx when Marx said that markets are ways of cheating the workers, and if you want to have a society that's fair, that doesn't cheat the workers, you can't have large-scale market exchange, and you can't have people getting hired by private businesses, that just leads to exploitation. If you get rid of markets, then you have a hell of a time figuring out how to organize the economy, and no matter how hard they tried, and they did try very hard, trying to organize an entire national economy top-down via central planning as though it's some kind of large collective war or dam-building effort just doesn't work too well, as shown most strikingly in the extraordinary difference in economic growth over the say, first generation of Maoist rule, the 33 years or so between the end of World War II on the one hand and Deng Xiaoping's southern expedition and abandonment of central planning as an economic strategy at the end of the 1970s. Then, right, he wasn't stupid. He could look across the Straits of Taiwan. He could say that back in the 1930s and in the 1940s, these people in the Guomindang were corrupt and fairly incompetent, and certainly not what we regard as very good rulers. So how come they've managed to do so much better on the other side of the Taiwan Strait than we have? They must have lucked onto some system that's better than ours. And he then took action. But things got worse between 1800 and 1980 or so for reasons other than that some countries had the bad luck to be ruled by people who believed what Karl Marx's strictures against the market economy. The first is demographic burdens. Poor countries are countries in which you're not too confident your children are going to survive to adulthood. Poor countries are countries in which people are going to want to have a lot of children because that's the only way of providing themselves with old age insurance, in the sense of having someone likely to be around when they're old who will be willing to take care of them, as opposed to throwing them into the ditch and passing on. What this means is if a country has been poor over the past 2 centuries, it's had a higher growth rate of population, which means that a much larger share of its investment has to be diverted to simply creating enough capital to equip the new workers with enough to produce at the previous rate, rather than deepening the capital intensity of the economy and so raising productivity. You see this mostly, I think, most strikingly in Egypt. Egypt in 1800 had 3 million people in it and was quite poor. Egypt today has 81 million people in it. Population growth at a factor of 27 over 2 centuries. And it's not as though Egypt has an awful lot of land to farm. Right? What land it does that you can farm is very good land. You have millions of years of organic silt brought down from the highlands of Africa by the river Nile. That the Nile Delta and the Nile Valley is incredibly fertile and prosperous agricultural land. But there isn't that much of it, and there was barely enough of it for 3 million people in 1800, and now there are 81 million people. And so over the past 2 centuries, right, Egypt, without a huge amount of natural resources, has had to divert a huge chunk of its investment to trying to find ways to support all those extra 78 million and get them jobs, which it's done okay at. Not great, but okay. But that's a reason. That's a reason why high population growth countries are relatively poor countries today. One of the things that works too, investment. Countries that invested a lot seem to do significantly better. And countries that invested were rich had a much easier time investing a lot because if you're a rich country already, that means you're relatively good at making machines, that machines are cheap in your country. And if machines are cheap in your country, then if you divert a little bit of spending from private consumption, you get a whole lot of investment goods for that diversion. By contrast, if you're a poor country, that means that machines are expensive, and so even a large diversion of resources away from consumption gets you relatively little in the sense of extra useful capital equipment to amplify your productivity. So if you're a poor country, you have a very hard time matching the savings effort of the rich, and so that makes economic development extraordinarily difficult. Those countries that have done it, best, have been places like South Korea that have opened themselves up to imports of manufactured machinery from the industrial core. That even when the South Korean government was most interested in nurturing domestic industries, it said that if you're a growing domestic industry and you want to import a piece of machinery from elsewhere in the world, you can do so tariff-free. In fact, we'll give you a subsidy to do so, because we know you need machines more sophisticated than we can make here at home yet, and we really want you to have those extra machines. But differences in population growth rates in the fact that you haven't yet gone through the demographic transition by which population growth drops if you're poor, and differences in relative price structures, they're smaller than differences in the efficiency of labor, differences in technology and organization. Even within market economies, most of the action in international inequality is differences in the efficiency of labor worldwide. And here the problem is things get difficult. Because to get a high efficiency of labor, you need to have the government build and maintain a lot of infrastructure. You need to educate your people. And when people are poor, it's very difficult to educate them. And even when people are rich, it's kind of hard to induce relatively young people to spend an awful lot of money on education, especially if they're worried about their potential student loan debt. Is there anyone here who thinks they're going to graduate from Berkeley owing more than $50,000 to the student loan debt? Okay. 25,000? Okay, that's nice. 10,000? Okay. For practically all Americans, aside from those who are children of the upper middle class, if you graduate from college with less than $50,000 in student loan debt, you're lucky. And a lot of people aren't willing to take on that kind of debt burden in an uncertain future, even though the economists say, look, given your skills and given the likely complexion of the future, you could easily pay off that $50,000 in less than a decade with your extra earnings. That means that a large educational effort also has to be financed by the government. And so in order to get the infrastructure and the education, you need an honest and competent government. And an honest and competent government, well, you need it as well for other reasons, too. If you don't have an honest and competent court system, then pretty soon people are going to be turning their attention from figuring out how to make things more productively to figuring out how to gain political influence so they don't get their money stolen from them through illegal or legal process in some way.